The producer on the film, Peggy Brotman, had been a casting director, and she said, you know who hasn't been seen in a long time is Lee Van Cleef.
I'm not a fool, Plissken.
Call me Snake.
You think you know Escape from New York is John Carpenter's dystopian action masterpiece where Kurt Russell's Snake Plissken infiltrates a maximum security prison island? But the real danger was cast and crew surviving actual urban decay, gang-controlled neighborhoods, and a budget so small it forced revolutionary creativity. Behind Snake's iconic eye patch and the futuristic wasteland was a punk rock production where a visionary director fought studio executives, composed his own synthesizer score, and transformed Kurt Russell from Disney child star into cinema's ultimate anti-hero. What you're about to discover will shock you. Filming in genuinely dangerous St. Louis ruins where real criminals became threats, future Titanic director James Cameron building miniature New York on a poverty budget, and a film so misunderstood on release that it nearly vanished before becoming a cult phenomenon. The prison was fake, but the chaos was devastatingly real. John Carpenter, director, co-writer, composer John Carpenter, arrived at Escape from New York carrying the weight of Halloween's massive success and the pressure to prove he wasn't just a horror director. His decision to tackle dystopian science fiction action represented enormous creative risk, especially with a premise so dark and cynical that studios initially rejected it as uncommercial and politically dangerous. The Watergate scandal and post-Vietnam political disillusionment directly inspired Carpenter's vision of a corrupt, incompetent government willing to sacrifice citizens for political convenience. His screenplay, co-written with Nick Castle, imagined America's moral decay made literal through Manhattan, transformed into a maximum security prison where society's unwanted were simply abandoned to die. The St. Louis location gamble saved the production financially, but created dangerous working conditions. Carpenter chose decaying, genuinely abandoned neighborhoods that required minimal set dressing to appear post-apocalyptic. This budget necessity created authentic atmosphere that expensive Hollywood sets couldn't match, but it also exposed cast and crew to real urban dangers. Studio battles with AVCO Embassy consumed Carpenter's energy throughout production. Executives questioned every creative choice, from the anti-hero protagonist to the dark ending, demanding changes that would have sanitized his dystopian vision. Carpenter fought to maintain creative control while watching his already minimal budget shrink further through studio interference. Kurt Russell, Snake Plissken. Kurt Russell's transformation from Disney's wholesome action hero into Snake Plissken represented one of cinema's most successful image reinventions, deliberately destroying his clean-cut persona to create a cynical, morally ambiguous anti-hero who defined 1980s cool through sheer attitude and minimal dialogue. Russell's preparation involved systematically developing Snake's distinctive physicality, the predatory walk, the rasping whisper voice, the economical movements suggesting coiled violence ready to explode. He studied martial artists and predatory animals, seeking ways to communicate lethal capability through body language rather than dialogue or action sequences the budget couldn't afford. The eye patch became more than costume. It fundamentally altered Russell's performance by limiting his vision and forcing constant head movements to scan his environment. This physical constraint made Snake's hypervigilance and paranoia authentic rather than theatrical, as Russell genuinely couldn't see approaching threats from his blind side. Carpenter's direction gave Russell unprecedented creative freedom to develop Snake's personality through improvisation and subtle choices. Their collaborative process established a director-actor partnership that would span decades and multiple films, built on mutual trust and shared vision of character-driven genre filmmaking. The Ensemble cast secrets, Lee Van Cleef's casting as Police Commissioner Bob Houck brought Western genre gravitas to dystopian science fiction, his lined face and cold eyes perfectly embodying authority without morality. Van Cleef understood playing men whose competence masked ethical bankruptcy, making Houck's manipulation of Snake feel ruthlessly pragmatic rather than cartoonishly villainous. Ernest Borgnine's Cabby provided crucial comic relief without undermining the film's dark tone. His cheerful survival in Manhattan's nightmare suggested resilience and adaptability that made the apocalypse survivable through optimism rather than Snake's cynical violence. Borgnine improvised much of Cabby's dialogue, bringing genuine warmth to the wasteland. Isaac Hayes brought blaxploitation cinema swagger to the Duke, the criminal overlord ruling Manhattan's ruins. His imposing physical presence and musical background informed a performance that made the Duke genuinely threatening despite limited screen time. Hayes understood how charisma could substitute for extensive character development in low-budget genre filmmaking. Adrienne Barbeau, Carpenter's wife at the time, played Maggie with toughness that avoided typical female victim tropes. Her casting created production complications as Carpenter balanced professional direction with personal relationship dynamics. But Barbeau's performance demonstrated women could inhabit action roles without requiring rescue or romantic subplot necessity. St. Louis as New York. The decision to film in East St. Louis's genuinely abandoned, crime-ridden neighborhoods created authentic post-apocalyptic atmosphere, while exposing the production to real dangers that made insurance companies nervous and crew members genuinely fearful for their safety during night shoots in uncontrolled locations. Urban decay wasn't set dressing, but economic reality. Entire city blocks stood abandoned as industries departed and populations fled, leaving hollow buildings and empty streets that required minimal modification to appear as Manhattan's prison future. This authenticity gave Escape from New York visual credibility that studio backlots couldn't replicate. Local gangs and criminals inhabiting these neighborhoods became both extras and security threats. The production hired some as background performers and security, turning potential antagonists into collaborators, but genuine dangers remained. Equipment theft, confrontations with people who didn't want filming in their territory, and general unpredictability made every location shoot tense. Night shooting served dual purposes, hiding budgetary limitations while creating oppressive atmosphere that made the city feel genuinely threatening. Darkness obscured the limited extras, minimal set modifications, and the fact that futuristic Manhattan was actually decaying St. Louis, while forcing audiences into Snake's perspective of navigating hostile territory with limited visibility. The miniatures revolution. James Cameron's involvement as part of the miniatures team represented a crucial but little-known connection between Escape from New York and future blockbuster filmmaking. Cameron, years before Terminator made him famous, helped create the revolutionary model work that convinced audiences of futuristic Manhattan on a poverty budget. The glider landing sequence showcased forced perspective and miniature work that rivaled effects in films costing 5 times Escape's budget. Models of Manhattan skyscrapers, streets, and the presidential plane were meticulously detailed and filmed with techniques that created convincing scale despite their actual small size. Practical effects necessity forced innovation that pre-CGI filmmakers had to master. Every explosion, vehicle crash, and environmental effect required physical construction and in-camera execution, demanding precision that digital effects would later make unnecessary. This limitation paradoxically created tangible realism that some argue CGI still struggles to replicate. The landing approach to Manhattan Prison became one of cinema's most memorable sequences through pure technical ingenuity. Combining miniatures, matte paintings, and careful camera work created seamless integration between practical elements that shouldn't have been possible with the available resources and time constraints. The political edge Escape from New York's post-Vietnam cynicism positioned authority figures as incompetent villains more dangerous than the criminals they claimed to fight. Carpenter's worldview rejected traditional heroic narratives where government represented legitimate order worth preserving, instead showing power structures as self-serving and morally bankrupt. The president's portrayal as a cowardly, ungrateful politician who views Snake's sacrifice as merely expected service rather than heroic action crystallized Carpenter's contempt for political leadership. Donald Pleasance played the commander-in-chief as a petty bureaucrat concerned primarily with image and political survival, rather than actual governance or citizen welfare. Urban apocalypse fears reflected Reagan-era anxieties about city crime and social decay. But Carpenter subverted conservative law and order politics by suggesting that government abandonment and economic neglect created urban nightmares rather than individual moral failure. Manhattan's transformation into prison literalized conservative impulses to simply wall off rather than address urban problems. The anti-hero protagonist rejected traditional heroic morality by making Snake explicitly selfish and immoral. He didn't save the president from idealism or patriotic duty, but from self-preservation and coercion. This moral ambiguity challenged action cinema conventions, requiring heroes motivated by justice or righteousness. Production nightmares, budget battles plagued Escape from New York constantly as AVCO Embassy's modest $6 million allocation proved inadequate for Carpenter's vision. The production perpetually ran out of money mid-shoot, forcing creative compromises, schedule compressions, and desperate measures to complete scenes before funds completely evaporated. Equipment failures in harsh urban environments created daily crises. Cameras malfunctioned from cold during night shoots, lighting equipment failed in abandoned buildings without reliable electricity, and vehicles required for chase sequences broke down repeatedly. Every technical problem consumed time and money the production couldn't spare. Night shooting in dangerous locations meant working when visibility was worst and threats were highest. Cast and crew worked exhausted, cold, and constantly aware that abandoned St. Louis neighborhoods weren't controlled film sets, but real places where genuine criminals operated and production security couldn't guarantee safety. Safety violations by modern standards were routine. Stunts performed without adequate preparation, actors working in structurally unsound buildings, and sequences filmed in genuinely hazardous conditions that contemporary insurance and unions would never permit. This cavalier approach to safety was typical of low-budget 1980s productions, but created real injury risks. The synthesizer score Carpenter's decision to compose Escape from New York's iconic synthesizer score stemmed partly from budget necessity, but primarily from his conviction that he understood the film's emotional needs better than any hired composer. His electronic soundtrack became inseparable from the film's identity and defined 1980s action aesthetics. The low-budget solution of director as composer saved substantial money on composer fees and recording sessions. Carpenter and collaborator Alan Howarth created the entire score using minimal synthesizer equipment in makeshift studios, producing professional quality music through technical skill and musical intuition rather than expensive resources. The 80s synthesizer sound that Escape from New York helped popularize influenced countless action films, video games, and electronic music genres. Carpenter's pulsing electronic rhythms and ominous melodic themes became shorthand for dystopian futures and anti-hero protagonists throughout the decade. Character themes and musical motifs enhanced atmosphere more effectively than traditional orchestral scoring. Snake's theme communicated coiled menace through repetitive electronic bass lines and metallic percussion, while the President's music suggested pompous incompetence through deliberately cheesy synthesizer flourishes. Legacy and influence Snake Plissken achieved icon status through minimal screen time and dialogue, proving that attitude and presence could create memorable characters more effectively than extensive backstory or emotional arcs. His eye patch, leather jacket, and gravelly voice became instantly recognizable symbols of anti-establishment cool. The dystopian blueprint Escape from New York established influenced decades of post-apocalyptic action cinema from Mad Max sequels to recent films like the Purge series. Carpenter's vision of societal collapse made literal through urban decay and government abandonment became genre template filmmakers repeatedly adapted. Video game aesthetics drew directly from Escape's visual design and narrative structure. Metal Gear Solid creator Hideo Kojima openly acknowledged Snake Plissken as primary inspiration for Solid Snake, demonstrating the film's impact beyond cinema into interactive entertainment. The 1996 sequel, Escape from LA, represented creative betrayal of the original through self-parody and excessive CGI that abandoned the gritty practical effects that made Escape from New York convincing. Carpenter's cynical rehash suggested he no longer believed in Snake's world, destroying the character's mystique. Escape from New York proved that limitations breed innovation and punk attitude beats polish. Carpenter didn't just make dystopian action. He created a blueprint for independent genre filmmaking that influenced generations while nearly destroying himself in dangerous St. Louis ruins. Subscribe to discover more incredible stories of visionary directors who fought studios, budgets, and common sense to create cult classics.